Today we are talking about this, the DJI Mavic 3. Now originally I intended this to be my full review, however between the weather, human malware and some other things, my plans have actually changed. This video is going to be my extended thoughts stroke review on the Mavic 3, but please don't expect to see any pretty footage, much out and about footage, or talk around very specific features and capabilities. More than anything, this is going to be my thoughts having spent a few weeks with this drone, comparing it to my Mavic 2 Pro as well as my Inspire 2. And what I want to do is just give you my overall thought process on where I think this drone is in the lineup of DJI drones, as well as if I think you should consider buying this as a Mavic 2 Pro or Inspire 2 user, or as a general drone user as well. Now, just before we get into the video, I want to say a massive thank you to Ben at 3DXR in the UK. He very kindly lent me his Mavic 3 Cine to allow me to spend some time with it, as well as make this video on the channel. If you're interested in getting yourself one of these, the Mavic 3, whether it be the standard or the Cine like I've got here, or anything else for your drone, plane, or any related RC equipment, please do check them out. There is a link to them in the description of this video. I would not have been able to make this content as well as many other pieces of content without support of Ben at 3DXR, and I just want to say a massive thank you up front for lending me this over the holiday period, so I got to spend some time with it. Anyway, let's get on with the video and let's talk about the craft first of all. Now, the Mavic 3 is very much a Mavic in the sense it is a folding drone. It comes in about the same size as a Mavic 2 and weighs just under 900 grams. When you pick it up for the first time, everything is very familiar. You have your folding arms, your camera up front, although the big change on this is rather than the battery going in the top like on the previous Mavics, it now goes into the back on this drone. Like pretty much every new model from DJI, it is an all-new battery as well, which is a 5000 milliamp hour 4S pack that DJI say give you up to about 38 minutes flight time. However, in my testing, you're lucky to get about 31, 32. Looking around the drone, we have the whole new camera setup on the front, which consists of that dual sensor setup with the larger 4/3 image sensor like we had on the X5S on the Inspire 2, as well as that telephoto 1/2 inch sensor that they've included as well. When I talk about the cameras later on, I'm not really going to be saying much about that small sensor that's on the front, and I'm going to be concentrating on the 4/3. I'll discuss why that is later on, but the reality is for me that smaller sensor really doesn't offer any big benefits, and for me personally I wish it wasn't there and there was more improvement on the 4/3 side. Now, the craft itself, as I said, weighs just under 900 grams, and it does feel a little bit cheaper than previous Mavics that have come before. Whilst I don't think it is cheaper made, the plastics feel a lot more hollow and they have a more scratchy sound to them, and the craft will even sort of bend in on the sides when you grab it, and it just feels a little bit more fragile compared to previous models. That also extends into the arms, and because they are longer and keeping the craft up higher off the deck, there is a bit of flex in the arms that we haven't really had in the other models too. It's not that it's cheap, it just feels like they've had to cut all of the weight down as much as they possibly can, and that's reflected in the feel of the plastics. The motors on this are pretty much the same as what we've seen on the Mavics before, with nothing really any different or special there. And the Mavic 3 has all new object avoidance sensors located all round, with our 2 sensors on the front. We've got 2 sensors on the top, 2 sensors on the back, and our traditional vision positioning system on the bottom, as well as the LEDs and the TOF sensor. From that side of things, the Mavic 3 is fully packed, and it has all that object avoidance like we've seen on models from DJI as well as Autel, although in my experience it doesn't quite work as well as some of the others, but we will talk about that when we move into active track a little bit later. The craft itself, as I've said, is a Mavic, and really there isn't anything dramatic here other than the big changes with the additional sensors and the new camera module. The one thing you will notice with that camera module is it isn't actually as big as you would expect when you first get the drone. Whilst it does have that much larger sensor, the overall module size isn't dramatically bigger, and it is quite impressive that they've managed to pack in 2 sensors into the front. There is also something interesting on the Mavic 3 that I haven't seen mentioned a lot, and that is when you turn it off, it actually locks the gimbal to prevent it moving around. So for instance, if I move the aircraft right now, the gimbal is actually locked in place and it holds it nice and steady, allowing you to put the gimbal cover on easily when you're packing away. Moving on to that gimbal cover, and that is this thing here. I'll be honest, I'm really not a fan of the jock strap as it has become known. It does a job, but it really doesn't do what I would expect the gimbal guard to do, and that is stop the gimbal moving around and protect it in transit. The reality is, on this Mavic 3, just like many of the others, the arms, when folded up, do actually rub on the back of the gimbal arms, and it's actually starting to leave marks. This is something a number of other people have also mentioned, and it's a result of the design of this thing here. Whilst it's fairly easy to put on, it really feels like a bit of an afterthought, and I'm not really sure what DJI was thinking with this compared to the way they've done it in the past. I know there has been problems with pretty much all of the gimbal guards on the Mavics. For instance, the plastic clear one on the Mavic 2 does scratch the camera in itself. However, I think there's more that could have been done here, and it just feels a little bit of a faff overall. Moving back to the aircraft, and as I mentioned earlier, this one here is the Cine model, and this features that 1TB SSD built in. That allows you to not only record in H.264 and 265 like the standard model, but you can also record in ProRes. That means you're able to record much higher bitrate footage and try to get the best possible images possible from that new 4/3 sensor. I'm going to talk about that in the camera section a little later in the video, because whilst it is nice to have that ProRes option, I am a little disappointed in the difference between the footage in H.265 and ProRes, for instance. And in my initial tests that I've done with this drone, the reality is the quality of the footage between those two modes is virtually identical. But we will talk about that more as we move on later in the video. Again, because this is the Cine, this one came bundled with this, the new RC Pro. This is DJI's new smart controller designed to be used with the Mavic 3, and this is quite a big upgrade on previous models of this remote. For me, this is actually the gem in the Mavic 3 bundle, and whilst the drone itself does have some improvements, this remote has come a long way from its earlier versions, and the new RC Pro is the best DJI remote that I have used on any of their drones. The image quality on the screen is simply outstanding, and when paired with the Mavic 3 with that OcuSync 3 Plus, the live feed is the best I have ever seen OcuSync look. It looks like SD card recorded footage. It is that clear and that crisp, and it offers fantastic range as well. Whilst the remote does a lot good, there are also a few downsides for me as well, and that is the DJI Fly app. Whilst previous Mavics were running on the Go 4 app, DJI in their wisdom have decided to use the Fly app on this one, and for me it has a number of issues that I find frustrating, including the move around of the features that I'm used to having in certain places on Go 4, the camera settings layout, the missing features under the camera, as well as the overall size of the information on the display. I actually find the OSD info along the top, such as the battery level, just too small, and I don't understand why DJI have intentionally made it that small, because there is still plenty of screen real estate on this remote, even if you made those icons bigger. There are a number of real little annoyances for me with the RC Pro as a result of the DJI Fly app, and at the moment the Fly app really does feel like an app that was designed for lower end models, and it is missing a lot of features that Mavic users such as the Mavic 2 Pro user would have expected to have in a drone with that camera fitted. Next, we're going to talk about how this aircraft feels in flight, as well as some of the special features. Now, the Mavic 3 flies a bit different, in my opinion, to previous models. The controls feel quite mushy, spongy, and almost delayed at times, and I also think the PIDs on the aircraft are a little bit low as well. It also has a bit of an annoyance that it has that coordinated turns feature turned on all of the time. If you don't know what that is, it's when you're flying forward, rather than when you apply yaw, the aircraft just rotate, it actually does that more fixed wing banking move, and it's an annoyance when you're trying to get nice aerial footage. For me, who flies camera drones all of the time, I'm used to flying it in a certain way, and I'm having to adapt how I fly for this model. If you've only ever flown this, you will be fine with that. However, if you're someone that flies camera drones all of the time, you'll have some specific moves set up, and you're having to do things slightly differently on this because it does react differently. Overall, as I've said, it doesn't fly particularly bad, but it does feel a bit of a mixture between the DJI FPV drone and the previous Mavics, and I would like to see DJI improve the feel because, as I said, it's just a bit mushy and even delayed at times when you move the stick compared to how the aircraft responds. Whilst the controls feel a bit numb, what I do want to say though, the aircraft does shift in sport mode, and it is so much quieter than we've seen from previous models. There is also the Cine mode on it as well, although it's not really tripod mode and it's a bit of a strange hybrid mode, and for me, I would personally prefer to have that original tripod mode that DJI had rather than the Cine mode, and I know Philip Bloom has been making quite a bit of noise around that himself as well. Overall, it doesn't fly particularly bad, but it doesn't feel quite as locked in as previous models, but not all is bad, and as I've said, the sound from this is so much quieter, and that really is very good when you're flying around where there is people. I have also noticed that it does move around a bit in its own prop wash, especially if you're doing punch up and downs, and you can see at times that the PIDs just feel a little bit loose. With regards to the special features on it, with things like active track and all of the additional flight modes, there's quite a bit I could say here, but I'm going to keep it short. Right now, active track feels very much like a beta feature, and it is frankly all over the place. In my tests, the drone moves around, it buckaroos, it moves left, it moves right, and it's just completely indecisive of what it wants to do. I would not be trusting the object avoidance sensors on this in active track in any shape or form, and whilst it is something DJI added after launch, at this moment in time it very much feels like a beta feature, and it is not something I would recommend you use unless you're somewhere completely wide open. I would certainly be avoiding bringing it through trees and things like that, because it just doesn't know what it wants to do a lot of the time. I haven't gone into too much depth on the other special features on the Mavic 3. As far as I'm aware, they're doing all of the usual things like the smart shots, but it was active track more than anything that I was interested in. And whilst it does have all of these new object avoidance sensors, I think DJI have got a lot of work to do on this with regards to them, and especially that active track mode as well. Okay, so it's time to talk about the cameras. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time comparing the footage on my Mavic 2 Pro, the Mavic 3, as well as my Inspire 2. I've taken them all out and about at the same time and taken stills, both JPEGs and RAWs, taken H.265 footage on all three, and ProRes footage on the Mavic 3 as well. Now, talking about stills first of all between these two models, and the reality is, for me, in all my checks, in all my tests, there is basically no difference between the Mavic 2 Pro and the Mavic 3. And actually, I would argue the Mavic 2 Pro looks a little bit better in good light, and that is because the image has slightly less noise reduction and less processing. The image quality between these two drones is so close, it's almost indistinguishable, and there is no upgrade in that camera compared to that one from a general stills in good light point of view. With regards to video in H.265, well, things are very much the same. They come out almost the same. I tested the Mavic 2 in HQ and standard mode, and obviously in HQ mode, they are both comparable. And whilst this is doing subsampling in HQ mode, the image quality is as good, although you do lose some of the field of view on this one as a result of going into that mode. My point more than anything is between these two drones in H.265, there is no difference in quality that most users will distinguish. In general, good light, they both look good, they both look good enough, and you're not going to be buying this to get an upgrade in image quality over this one because it simply isn't there. Comparing again to the Inspire 2, well, that has the legs on both of these, and whilst it has the same size sensor, it's just that improvement in lens quality comes across. But again, it isn't dramatic. These three do come out very close when you do look at them. That then leaves the question of the Cine, and where does that stand in comparison to the Mavic 2 and even H.265. And in my tests, in my checks, I basically cannot tell the difference between H.265 on the Mavic 3 and ProRes. The image file size is dramatically different, but in good daylight, the overall image quality is the same. There is literally so little difference between that ProRes codec and the H.265. If you were looking to buy the Mavic 3, I would only consider the Cine if you have to have native ProRes recording. You're really not gaining anything other than the increased file size and the ability to record on board the aircraft. Now, there is one scenario in this that I haven't mentioned, and that is low light, because whilst ProRes doesn't make a difference in daylight, it does make a difference at nighttime. And something that should be said is the night performance on the Mavic 3 in ProRes is dramatically better than the Mavic 2 Pro. So if you were looking to get one for low light, this would be the better choice. H.265 is less noisy than the Mavic 2, but the ProRes is substantially less noisy than all of the other models, and that's probably the one party trick this new camera does have. Overall, from an image quality point of view, I have to say, other than low light, there is no difference between these two models. 99.99% of users would ever be able to tell, and there really is no benefit in upgrading from the Mavic 2 Pro to the Mavic 3 for image quality unless you're looking for low light footage. Now, just before I jump to my final thoughts, I just want to talk a bit more about the Cine model ProRes and the workflow around that. As I've mentioned, I don't really see any difference between the H.265 and ProRes, but if you've bought the Cine model, you're going to want to use that ProRes footage. But that does come with some limitations, and that is getting the footage off the aircraft. It records to that fixed onboard SSD, but the only way to get that data off is to connect it to your PC via the supplied high-speed USB-C cable. It will allow you to download in about 25 minutes in my tests the full SSD, but it isn't exactly a pro workflow, and if you need to do this in the field, you're going to need to bring a laptop with you because it isn't compatible with standalone offloading devices. There is also the quirk that you need to turn the drone on to offload the footage, and it then uses battery whilst transferring the footage to your computer, which again means you're going to have a spare battery for offloading footage between shoots if you are going to use it as a pro user. It is a bit of a strange combination with the Cine model, and it is interesting that DJI didn't put a Pro badge on this drone, because whilst it's easy to assume it is a Pro drone, I really still think this is a consumer model with a ProRes feature, but it certainly doesn't fall into the Pro category like we've seen on other models before. Now, this is Ian from the future. Since making the bulk of this video, a few things have changed. First of all, DJI have released a big firmware update in the end of January, which adds a lot of the features that people have been complaining about being missing. We will talk about that specifically in a minute. There's also been talk around GPS acquisition times being very long on the Mavic 3 as well, and I just want to talk about that a little bit too. In all of my testing on the Mavic 3, I didn't particularly find the GPS system slow or fast to acquire satellites. Overall, it behaved exactly as I would expect. However, many people are seeing very long acquisition times of more than 3-4 minutes even. Now, as I said, in my tests, it didn't seem particularly off and it seemed to do what I expect, but there has been some changes that DJI have made to the GPS system on the Mavic 3. If we hop over to the desktop and take a look at the A2S from DJI, you can see that the GPS system that they're using on this drone was the same as they've used pretty much on all of their drones, which was GPS, GLONASS and Galileo. However, if we look at the Mavic 3, they have replaced GLONASS with Beidou. Now, that means that there's a different set of satellites that the aircraft is going to be looking for. I don't know if this long acquisition time is a result of this change, because personally I didn't find it particularly different, and it doesn't really add up in itself that the GPS sat change would affect it, because people are reporting not only is it taking longer on cold boot but on warm boot as well. The way GPS generally works is that it will actually store the locations of the most acquired satellites that you used last in its memory. So if you were to say swap the battery, it basically gives it much quicker acquisition times than you had starting from completely cold. There's a little battery in the GPS which stores this, and you will often find that when you're flying for the first time, it takes a minute or so to acquire GPS on most drones, and then if you swap your battery, it will almost instantly acquire the satellites again, and that is because it is storing that GPS info. However, reports on the Mavic 3 are people say that it is as slow no matter what it's been booted at, so whether it's cold or they're rebooting for a second or third pack, which sort of for me rules out the GPS satellite thing. Personally, I do think there might be a bit more going on here than we understand, in the sense of DJI may be slowing acquisition times to wait for the remote to grab GPS lock as well, because there is requirements in various remote ID standards for not only the aircraft to have lock for location, but the remote too. And we may have a situation where DJI is actually doing that before the standard comes into place. I don't personally know. I don't strictly think, though, it's relating to them moving over to the different SAT system, because it doesn't make sense that people are seeing long wait times even with hot swapping packs. Now, since recording that original bit of the video and handing back the Mavic 3, DJI have released quite a big update, version 01.00.0500, and this is an update that released on the 24th of January that adds a lot of the missing features people have been complaining about. Just to be clear up front though, most of what they've added here really doesn't affect my opinion on the drone. For instance, they've now added quick shots, including all of the usual modes. They've added panorama modes, burst shooting, digital zoom for normal video. Those features were missing, but they really weren't anything I'm complaining about in this review, because I knew they were going to come. It wasn't ideal that DJI did ship the drone without them. However, they have been added. If we go down the list, there's a lot of little tweaks that they've added, such as setting the return to home altitude for advanced return to home. They've now added a special USB mode for transferring the data off the Cine model. My understanding is this doesn't really improve how fast it takes or change the workflow. It simply changes the aircraft's battery usage whilst it's offloading data, and it sort of puts the aircraft into a low power state. But the fact remains, you still need to connect it to a PC, not an external device, and it will need to be connected to that for the duration of the offload. So the workflow hasn't really improved. It just should use a little less battery when doing so. There are a couple of other optimizations, such as the color and stuff, but I will be honest with you, there is nothing in this update, as far as I'm aware, that will change my perception on the drone. And the thoughts I'm going to give you at the end here now, which was recorded before this firmware released, basically, as far as I'm concerned, remain the same. Okay, so to give you my final thoughts on the Mavic 3. Now, there's a lot to say here, however, I will try to keep it as short as possible. I'm going to say up front, I do think that the Mavic 3 is probably the best consumer drone on the market right now. It has some fantastic features. The largest sensor we see on a folding drone. It is quieter than the Mavic 2. It has much longer flight time. It has all-round object avoidance sensors, and it has the best live view image quality I have seen on any drone period when coupled with that new RC Pro. Whilst talking about the RC Pro, for me, I really like that remote, and it is the best remote DJI have made in my opinion, although it isn't faultless, and I don't particularly like the features on the Fly app, and DJI do need to do some work on that to bring it up to the standard we would expect for a drone of this capability. I haven't tried the Mavic 3 with the original basic RCN1 that you get with the standard model, and I was a bit disappointed that DJI felt like they cheaped out on that one, because they're basically giving you the same remote that you get with a Mini. But at the end of the day, it is good enough to get it up and running, but I would personally be aiming to buy this drone with the RC Pro if I was going to do it. If you were looking to get yourself a Mavic 3 and you were trying to choose between the Cine and the standard model, well, the only real reasons to go for the Cine is improved low light performance in ProRes and that native ProRes recording. The image quality in good light is the same, in my opinion, in H.265 as in ProRes, and whilst ProRes does have some more latitude, the difference is so minimal, it's crazy, and it simply isn't worth the cost difference between that and the basic model. The only other thing to say for the Cine is you do get that RC Pro, but it is worth taking into account that DJI will be releasing a new pack in the future that should have the RC Pro with the standard model as well. The big question many will have is it an upgrade over the Mavic 2, and could you replace your Inspire 2 with it? Well, with regards to the Inspire, what you've got to ask yourself is, do you need the ability to change lenses? The image quality is very good. It's as close to the Inspire 2 as I have seen, but it is nowhere near as good as ProRes on the Inspire 2 or Cinema DNG, but it is good enough against SD card footage. So if you were looking to get yourself a smaller drone, that would actually do it. With regards to the Mavic 2, well, the upgrades again are flight time and low light performance if you go for the ProRes model. In normal daylight, the image quality between them is so close, the camera itself is really not the upgrade. It then comes down to flight time and the RC side of things if you wanted to get involved with the RC Pro. Overall, there is a lot to like here, but this drone really is far from finished today, and DJI have a lot of work ahead of them, especially on the flight characteristics as well as the overall features and capabilities with the Fly app. I personally would like to see the Fly app completely overhauled and bring it in line with what we had in Go 4. How long that will take, though, is another question. One other thing just worth mentioning is at the point of me making this video, the Mavic 3 is not compatible with the DJI SDK. So if you do need SDK support, you're going to need to go with one of the other models, although they have just added support on the other drones. Should you buy it then? Well, the question is this: what do you already own? If you own a Mavic 2, you're going to have to ask yourself, why do you want to upgrade? If it's flight time, go for it. If it's anything else, probably not. If you own a Mavic 1, a Mavic Mini, of course it's going to be an upgrade. It really is. What you've got to ask yourself, though, is what benefits you're getting for the price. Price has been a controversial subject on this drone because it isn't cheap. However, I don't particularly think it's expensive. I just think it is priced as a high-end model. But what is also interesting is DJI didn't put a Pro label on this drone, and that's probably why we've seen many of the little features missing. And I do wonder if we may see a Mavic 3 Pro appear in the future with some of the things that we haven't got on this one today. It would upset users if that happened, but I wouldn't be shocked to see it happen at some point because DJI have done those things before. Anyway, that's it. The Mavic 3. It's a good drone. It's far from perfect. It ain't really an upgrade from the Mavic 2 unless you want flight time, but there is a lot to like here. Would I buy one? Yes. Do I want one? Yes. Do I need one? Probably not. That's it from me. I want to say a massive thank you to Ben at 3DXR for supporting us in making this video. If you have found it useful, please do check out his website. He sells this as well as many other equipment, including the Cube Autopilot, HearLink, and anything you need for your aircraft. If you'd like to support the channel to allow us to maybe even buy one of these, please do check out our Patreon. There is a link in the description. Also a link there to buy me a coffee as well if you'd like to support us on a daily basis. There is also a link to my Discord channel in the description of this video too. Come over, say hi. If you've got any questions, I'll try and answer them there as well.